Hello and welcome to this past paper question on the Cold War. Explain one consequence of the Berlin Blockade. So, as with all consequences questions, we want to find out what happened because of the Berlin Blockade. So, what happened next? How did people feel about it? How did they react to it? What did it lead to in the end? That's what we're hoping to answer in this question. So let's think about the consequences. But before we do, we need to talk about the context. What was the Berlin blockade? Let's remind ourselves of the event. So we know that there was a breakdown in relations. After Potsdam, Germany was now divided definitely into four zones, and so was Berlin. And the Allied Control Commission was the nations coming together to try and work together. But that broke down. It wasn't working. So the West had formed their zones into Trizonia and created a new currency called the Deutschmark, which Stalin didn't very much like. It triggered him into then making a decision to block the western routes into Berlin. He blocked the road, the rail, and the canal access in 1948, hoping to starve the people of West Berlin and make the West realize it wasn't a sustainable thing to keep it going, and hopefully drive the West out of Berlin and take the capital for himself. And this is, of course, the first major challenge in the Cold War. So we need to find out what the consequences of this event were. So what could you write about in your answer? Well, what is the first major consequence? I mean, there only really is one thing that you can think about, and that's it leads to the airlift. This is the most direct consequence of the blockade. Obviously, you get the trouble going on in Germany, but the major consequence is the Berlin airlift. And the reason this happens is because the Allies cannot give ground to Stalin. They cannot stand down from Stalin's challenge. This is the first real challenge that they faced. It's the first confrontation of the Cold War. And really, it's also in keeping with the policy of containment, which says we will not give Stalin an inch. We won't let him spread communism around Europe. So this is really the first test that Truman himself has to stand up to. So he launches Operation Vittles, the Berlin airlift, and it lasts for about 10 months. And of course, they do thousands and thousands of tons of delivery. I mean, we're talking probably about 4,500 tons of stuff is delivered, 275,000 flights, and they go over 9 million miles or something like that, dropping things over by air because, of course, they can't take things in by rail or road. And Stalin dare not stop them. If he shoots down a plane, that could start World War, which would be devastating for the USSR at this time because they don't have the nuclear bomb. So, of course, the result is after 10 months of flying things into the city, Stalin backs down. And it's a huge propaganda win for the West because Stalin's seen as sort of aggressive, while they found a very peaceful solution to a very naughty situation. So, I mean, the major consequence of the Berlin blockade is the Berlin airlift. So what I want you to do is have a think about it. Look back at your notes and try and figure out what you've got in your notes. But pause this now and write yourself an answer. So one consequence of the Berlin blockade was the Berlin airlift, and then go into detail. Why was the Berlin airlift a consequence, and what did it lead to? What happened? Okay, right. Pause the video and good luck. Okay, so hopefully you've had a good chance to look into that and write a good couple of sentences, probably about a third of a page, hopefully, in your time. Let's have a look what I've put anyway and see if it matches up with what you've got. Here's an example of what you could start with. One consequence of the Berlin blockade was the Berlin airlift. Nice and simple. The Berlin airlift is going to happen. And this time I'm going to say what the Berlin airlift is, and then I'm going to say why it was a consequence. Well, I'm going to start by saying, despite road, rail and canal access to West Berlin now cut off, the Allies could not allow Stalin to starve the people out of the West Berlin. So the Allies launched Operation Vittles with the plan to fly thousands of tons of needed supplies like coal and food, and I've given those examples because that's nice to give an example to the examiner, into west of the city. Over the course of 10 months, the Allies were able to maintain the livelihoods of millions of inhabitants, even at the cost of 275,000 flights. Those facts are quite useful to throw in there and show the detail. Not only did this lead Stalin to back down in May 1949, there's the date, But it would go on to become a huge propaganda, I should say, win for the West, as they had found a peaceful solution to an aggressive situation. Fantastic. So we talked about what they did, but why is that a consequence then? Well, the US did this not only for moral reasons, but because it was Stalin's first challenge in the Cold War, and the US could not be seen to back down. And also, since the US was now following a policy of containment, and that was after the Truman Doctrine was announced, they could not allow Stalin to take further land at the expense of democratic freedoms. And in the end, they won. So that's fantastic. And of course, you could even finish by saying something like, and in the end, this would now cause further tension and have consequences of its own. For example, we know that NATO was created after this event. So that's something that you could put. But for now, that's fine. That tells you why it happened. So if I just give my pointer on there, we can see why it happened. And we've written about what the consequence itself was, and given lots of details about that consequence. So hopefully that's given you an idea of how an exam answer should look.